Hey everybody, Austin here again, doing a Q&A video, a backer Q&A video. I haven't done one of these in a long time, which is always the case with these videos. To put that into perspective, we are currently in November 2023 as of recording this video. I got these questions back in May 2023, so as always, I am pretty good at procrastinating. But better late than never, as I like to say. And so here we are with a Q&A that should have taken place 6 months ago. We have about 5 or 6 questions here, so this should be a relatively, I think, brief one. But what I'll do afterwards is, once this is up, I'll try to fish for some more topics of discussion, and hopefully we can try to get, this type of video going a little more often. I know some of you guys out there like me just sort of talking in a podcast style fashion. Some people have suggested I do a podcast, but I've just got so much stuff on my plate. I could try, but I don't think I'd be able to deliver consistently. So what's the point, So these Q&A videos, or backer Q&A videos, will sort of suffice in the meantime. So for anybody that likes this type of content, feel free to kick back, relax, or just go do stuff around your home, or I don't know, go for a jog and put some headphones on and listen, or go for a drive. I don't know. Do whatever you do when you listen to podcasts, and that's basically this type of video. So, but yeah, let's go ahead and just get right into it. So the first topic of discussion comes from Venom Lace, aka Keith Michaels here on YouTube. His name's constantly swapping back and forth. It's so weird. There's a couple of users I have where their names just changed, and I don't think they're doing it manually. But he is one of them. But he's Venom Lace over on Twitch, longtime supporter. Thank you very much for that, sir. He asks. Or he actually poses, discuss one game you enjoy across multiple platforms. What do you like about each? Is it the music or graphics on one over the other? Or is there additional content in one version when it's not in the other? Is there better performance? Or are there any other things that affect the experience that make you like it more? Well, I've been doing this for a really long time, and one of my favorite things for the longest time, especially in the 90s when this stuff was relatively cheap on the used market, was buying lots of different versions of games just to see like which one is the best, like which version of Doom back in the day would be my preferred one, or which version of Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter or Primal Rage or Wolfenstein 3D or Quake. So yeah, I'm gonna name a couple. It's hard for me just to do one, given how long I've been doing this. But yeah, let's go ahead and just start off with Doom. I mean, that's like the big elephant in the room when it comes to a game I enjoy across multiple platforms. All the versions from back in the day have their perks. I actually had started on the Super Nintendo version, which is, to most is probably the worst version from back then. But there's still a lot of things I really like about it. For one, it's Doom on a Super Nintendo. It's a thing that shouldn't even exist. But two, the soundtrack is killer. It's my favorite Doom soundtrack from back in the day, like hands down, easily. Like I'd rather listen to the Doom Super Nintendo music than even like the MS-DOS version using a MT32, MIDI processor. So that is one perk of that version. But then you've got other versions like the Jaguar port, which has, obviously it looks way better than the Super Nintendo, and it plays fairly well for the time. But there's no in-game music, which is kind of a bummer. But then you've got the PlayStation version, which has a crazy amount of levels, almost 60 stages, and it's got some updated graphical effects. You got some like lighted sectors, like different colored lighting in sectors, as opposed to just like white light or like very dim white light or no light. You've got like green or red or blue, and that really adds to the atmosphere. And of course they updated the soundtrack. They changed the music completely, so it's more ambience and sounds. which I actually prefer Doom's traditional rockin' soundtrack, or it's partially rockin'. There were ambient and moody tracks in both Doom and Doom 2. It wasn't all just like butt rock. But you know that the PlayStation soundtrack, while I don't like it as much as the original music, it does add for a totally different vibe. So whenever I want that really spooky vibe with classic Doom, I'll play the PlayStation version. And yeah, I mean, 32X version of Doom gets crapped on a lot, but I still find it to be pretty fun. It actually plays slightly better than the Jaguar version because it actually runs at a slightly higher frame rates, and it's a little more responsive as a result, and so I can still blitz right through that in about an hour and a half. And again, kind of like Doom on Super Nintendo, it's Doom on a Sega Genesis, basically. Yeah, you gotta have the 32X, but once the 32X is on, you don't, they're kind of like one you know, piece of equipment, like working in harmony, basically. Yeah, so I mean, I'm playing Doom on, you know, on my TV with the Sega Genesis and 32X with the Genesis controller, and it's like, man, this is fun. So, I mean, even 3DO Doom has some benefits. Like its soundtrack is pretty killer as well. Unfortunately, you have to shrink the screen size down as small as you can go if you want to make it playable. But yeah, music is great. So. And of course there's Saturn Doom. It's not a great conversion. There's an interesting story behind it, along with the 3DO Doom story. Both are very interesting stories. Hell, even Super Nintendo Doom story is really interesting. Doom just has an interesting story, period. Not in-game story, but I mean like the story of its development, you know, from id Software's original creation, which is really interesting in and of itself, to how all the different conversions came to be. You know, all that is just very interesting stuff. But I still have this like odd appreciation for the Saturn version, as bad as it is, because one of the perks to that one is your fire rate is way faster than it is in other versions, and so like your chain gun becomes this like monster of a weapon compared to other conversions of the game, other versions of the game. It's just kind of funny. We're gonna have to do a full playthrough of that again sometime soon, since I haven't done one on my channel, Saturn Doom, in quite some time. Same with Saturn Quake, although I'm not really looking forward to that one. So other games I enjoy across multiple platforms, you know, again, like I had mentioned, the fighting games. I do find the fighting games really interesting across different systems, like the original Mortal Kombat. You know, you had the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions, which have major differences. Like the SNES one looks a lot nicer, but the Genesis version plays a lot better. But then you had the portable versions, like the Game Boy one that runs at about 5 frames a second and has tons of input lag. The Game Gear version, which is what I grew up on, which has like these huge character sprites because of the Game Gear's lower resolution than standard consoles like the NES or Master System, and had a really good time with that version growing up. And then you had the Sega CD version, which adds the arcade soundtrack, you know, more gore, like if you knock enemies into the pit, you know, you've got the bodies and heads stuck on spikes and stuff like that. And then you got the, you know, the MS-DOS version, which is, I think, the closest to the arcade version from back in the day. And even that has different versions. I think one is on CD and one's on floppy disk. And, yeah, they're all kind of like fun versions in their own right. Depending on, you know, how you kind of go into them. Street Fighter 2, same way, lots of different versions of that. I mean, obviously back in the day we had the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions. Both are fun in their own right. I think I prefer the SNES ones overall, you know, when it comes to, you know, going between that and the Genesis. But the Genesis version of Champion Edition, which is basically Street Fighter 2 Turbo on Super Nintendo, is the Genesis has sound hardware that's closer to the original arcade boards, so you get that more arcade accurate sound package. So while the Genesis version might not look as good, you know, it's not as colorful, and the voices are terrible in the Genesis version. The music really kicks ass in the Genesis one. You know, again, it's more arcade accurate, which I think has its own appeal in and of itself. So. Other fighting games like Primal Rage, you know, not a super popular fighting game these days. I think it's kind of gotten a bad rap over the years, unfortunately, but part of it I think is due to a lot of its conversions. But I'm a huge fan of the original arcade game, and so I've played just about every home conversion from back in the day, except for like the Amiga version, which looks jank as hell, but I would still like to try it if I can get an emulator set up properly. But yeah, some versions still have perks, like the Super Nintendo version actually plays really well. You can actually string together a lot of like good combos just like you can in the arcade version. Whereas the Genesis version, while it ironically looks better than the Super Nintendo one, not by much, the Super Nintendo is normally known for having, you know, a higher color count on screen than the Genesis, but some games like Primal Rage just for some reason ended up looking even worse than the Genesis counterparts, which is weird, but the Super Nintendo version plays better. The Genesis version, a lot of your combos, they just don't work. You know, you try to string certain hits together, like you jump in with a jump kick, and then you do a strong down 3 and 4, the bottom 2 buttons. You know, and like a lot of times that just doesn't even connect in the Genesis one, whereas in the Super Nintendo one, like it works every time. You know, it's so. I still like playing all the different versions of the game. You know, PlayStation and Saturn versions, they're very similar to each other, but the PlayStation one, for some reason, I think the sprites look a lot bigger on screen, or slightly bigger, but they animate like really badly in the PlayStation version. There are so many gaps between you know, frames of animation in that it is jarring, and it also is a little bit on the glitchy side too in terms of like stringing hits together and doing combos. Saturn version is closer to the arcade games, got more frames of animation. That is just like a big benefit over the PlayStation version, but it's got long load times. I think they both have long load times, which is a bummer. I fired up the MS-DOS version recently again. That is definitely the best version of Primal Rage at home for the mid-90s, up until the Midway Arcade Treasures release, where the emulation was a lot more spot on. Very interesting stuff there. I don't think the sprites were super huge in the MS-DOS version, if I remember correctly, but they animate like beautifully. Like, I mean, they look very close to the arcade counterparts in terms of frames of animation, which is great. But yeah, I mean, I could go on. There's a lot of different like you know, conversions of games from one platform to another. Like just, you know, the original Halo Combat Evolved. Really love the original on Xbox, but then it got a PC port, and the PC port wasn't one-to-one. It wasn't perfect. It definitely had some glitches and stuff like that, or jankiness to it, but you had keyboard and mouse support, and you had like instant load times if you had a really powerful PC. So, you know, just even like conversions like that, I find interesting, and I like trying games across multiple platforms, be it like console to PC or PC to console, or arcade to console to PC, and all over the place, you know. And then I mean, Halo got another update later on. I got the Anniversary Edition on 360. I picked that up, and so I really enjoyed playing that on yet another console or another platform, because it had all these nice like graphical updates, which was really cool to see. But then you can switch back to the original graphics style, which was impressive in and of itself, being able to just flip on the fly. That was a really cool feature. So yeah, those are a handful of franchises that I like to play across multiple platforms. There are many more I could name. Many more, especially from the 8 and 16-bit era. You got, you know, shooters like R-Type and Raiden, and you know, you've got other sorts of arcade conversions that hit multiple systems, like you know, Strider, and you know, some of those Capcom CPS-1 games, and there's just a lot that I could mention. And but yeah, that was a fun one to discuss. So Venom asks a second question. He says, what is your go-to for retro gaming? Is it original hardware with original carts and discs? Is it original hardware and flash carts? Is it a Mr. FPGA? Is it emulators? And what are the pros and cons of each? For me, it is dependent. Really, I mean, I have been a hardware collector for a long time. I've always, you know, put pride into having real hardware as a video recorder and a streamer, because I think people appreciate that. you know, when I had an Atari Jaguar, which I actually sold recently to fund my pinball machine, you know, people would ask, hey, is this an emulator? And I'd be like, nope, this is the OG, the real deal. They would be like, whoa, that's so cool. You know, it's like, people appreciate it, you know. Now, emulation in some cases has come so far that that's actually a reason why I've started to downsize some of my collection, and it was actually a huge deciding factor in getting rid of my Jaguar. Yes, I'd love to still be able to fire it up, but the emulation's become so good that, you know, I don't think I'll miss the real thing all that much. Now, if it was a cheaper console, like an NES or Super Nintendo or original PlayStation, like there wouldn't be much reason for me to get rid of them because they're not really that valuable. I wouldn't get much back from them. But, you know, not just looking at it from a value standpoint, there is definitely you know, a special feeling you get when you're using original hardware. It's, you know, not just the controller. The controller is a huge aspect of it, but it's also just, you know, like if I've got my NES hooked up to my CRT, it's just a completely different vibe than when I'm using an emulator on an LCD screen or using even my FPGA consoles like my Retro USB AVS or using the Mr. FPGA. When I just sit down in front of like a glowy CRT, it just has a particular look to it. It's got a particular feel, like you pop a cartridge in and you see the screen flicker and flash real quick, as NES usually does when you turn it on, and oftentimes you'll hear like a little audio pop or cue, you know, as you know, it grabs that audio signal and and then the CRT glows again. You know, it's just, it's a vibe that it's very hard to get with, you know, software emulation or even some of the FPGA stuff. Now, I really love the FPGA stuff in particular because that's more of a convenience thing, like the Mr. FPGA, assuming I can get my Mr. working again. Currently, it's out of commission. But with some of these FPGA platforms, like the Mr. FPGA, you can actually output analog video to something like a CRT, cathode ray tube. Like with my analog consoles, I have their digital to analog converter, which is currently works with 2 of my analog consoles, and I'll hopefully have a 3rd analog console here soon with the Duo. They said it's going to ship by the end of the year. And so I can sort of get that OG feel on a CRT with those consoles. And what's great about analog's FPGA systems in particular is you can still use original cartridges. And while, you know, starting in about 2011, I think, I started down the path of flash carts. And so for anyone that doesn't know what a flash cartridge is, it's basically a cartridge you plug into any original piece of console hardware. It'll usually have a SD card slot on it or micro SD card slots. Some older flash carts would use compact flash, like the Retro USB Power Pack, or I think they were known as Retro Zone back then. But basically, you just load ROMs onto the SD card, and then it has a menu that pops up on the screen when you fire up the console, and you can just load up almost any game that you want. And it's great if you're just a player. But there is definitely something to owning the original cartridges. For the longest time, I would implore people to stop spending lots of money on real cartridges because the prices kept going up. They became harder to get, and it became a very expensive hobby. And I still actually feel that there are better things you can be spending your money on, wiser things, like planning for your future, and buying NES cartridges is not that. However, that said, I have, as of a couple years ago, started building a collection again of physical cartridges, just because I found it fun. So now I've got about 250 NES games. I've got about 80 to 90 Super Nintendo games, probably 30 to 40 Genesis cartridges, 25 N64. But when I pop out those systems in particular, you know, sometimes I'll just decide not to use my flash cart, and I will just go grab a handful of cartridges off my shelf. I'll just scan my shelf real quick. I'll be like, oh, there's Mega Man 5. Let me grab that and play that. Oh, there's Double Dragon 3. I want to play that. I haven't really messed around with this game much before, like Cycross or something, and, you know, bust that out and put some time into it, and just have like a smattering of games and just kind of like bounce between them and just, you know, have a good time, enjoy the night playing my physical games. And I get that classic feeling like I did when I was growing up, where, you know, I had games on a shelf. I would take them off the shelf and pop them in my console and then just go to town, and I'd have a good time with that. So, I mean, what is my go-to? It's just dependent really on how I feel, and it also depends on the goal. So if I'm trying to run a stream specifically, not necessarily just sit down and enjoy some video games on my own, it's just gonna depend. So there are some platforms where I don't have software emulation or FPGA options. Like if I want to play my 3DO, yes, there are software emulators for it, but they're not that great. They're still not that great. I've got to use the original hardware, and there's no FPGA solution for 3DO as of doing this video. So it's like I've got to bust out the original hardware. So if I'm going to stream some 3DO, that's going to come into my upscaler setup. I'm going to have to either use CDRs or original games. I don't have an optical drive emulator for that yet, which is ODEs are like the CD-ROM console equivalent of a flash cart. I think that's like a $300 purchase, and I just don't have the money for that. But in other cases, you know, with like some of the easier to replicate systems, like, you know, the NES and Super Nintendo, I've got a bunch of different options. If I'm streaming, a lot of times I'll either use the Mr. FPGA, or I'll use my FPGA dedicated consoles like the AVS for NES or the Super NT for Super Nintendo, and I'll just play them on my LCD screen. And what's great about those, I don't even need a flash card because they have SD card slots. Well, the Super NT has an SD card slot, and I've got the jailbreak on it, which just lets me load games off the SD card without even needing a flash card or real cartridges. So that's really convenient for streaming. But when I'm just like, I just want to play on my CRT by myself tonight, I'll just bust out the actual Super Nintendo, or I'll use the Super NT with the DAC, and whether I use a flash card or load ROMs off the SD card or use real cartridges, it's just dependent on a variety of factors as well. It's, again, the feel. It's like, you know, my save data. I've actually got not my Super Metroid cartridge. My Super Metroid cartridge, I think I need the battery replaced because it constantly resets all the data back to nothing, which is bad. But my Final Fantasy III cartridge, on the other hand, has save data that I'm slowly working on, you know, as the months go on. So, but yeah, Venom did ask, what are the pros and cons of each? You know, again, that kind of goes back to what I use is just dependent on the scenario. You know, there are pros and cons. You know, if you're using, you know, software emulators, especially on like a PC or something, or say you hacked a Xbox, you know, Series S or Series X or whatever, you might not be using like the original hardware's controllers. And, you know, I'm not going to actually really talk about that right now because that is a question, talking about original controllers, that I'll address later on in this video. But yeah, you might be stuck using like an Xbox controller or something. It's like, using an Xbox controller is fine. They're great controllers, but they don't feel right when you're playing an NES game, you know, or a Sega Genesis game or something like that. Yeah, they're serviceable, but you know, you just don't get that same feel. You don't get the old rectangular brick of an NES controller, and you don't get that snappy response with how, you know, the NES's domes underneath the controller buttons, you know, function, and you don't have the concave, you know, dips in the face buttons, which is, I think, key to, you know, button mashing games in particular, like Contra and Mega Man. It's key to the feel of those games, you know, that snappy, responsive feeling you get when you play those on an actual NES controller. So, you know, there are definitely cons to each of the methods of playing retro games, like I mentioned. But yeah, hopefully that covered the topic pretty well. And if you guys have any follow-up questions to that, feel free to post them down below, and I will try to respond in the comments section. Alright, so this is actually kind of an interesting one, a little bit different than the previous couple of topics. This comes from Die Hard Jagged, which is related to my YouTube journey as a whole. For anybody that doesn't know, I started off in 2009, had no idea what I was doing, still have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm still doing it. And he asks, or says, would you have done anything different in the early days of YouTube, knowing what I know now? Absolutely. I mean, and this goes for lots of different areas of life, not just YouTube, you know. Hindsight's 20/20, and knowing what you know now, I mean, you know, for me, in lots of areas of my life, yes, I would have done a lot of things different, knowing what I know now. And, you know, in terms of YouTube, what I would have done differently is I would have doubled down on, like, more retrospective type of content. Because my playthroughs have never really taken off. You know, I don't have many playthroughs on my YouTube channel that have tens of thousands of views. I can probably name those videos, you know, on one hand. Most of my videos probably have anywhere from 500 to 1,000 views. I mean, yeah, some of my videos have been around for 10, 12, 13 years. They've got a few thousand views, but like over the course of 10 or 12 plus years, that's not really a good, you know, ratio of activity. It's just not great. Not particularly motivating either. And I don't really look at a lot of my content and, you know, feel proud of it either, because it's just it all just stagnated. And my retrospective type of content, on the other hand, like in the early days, like they got a lot more views than my playthroughs. Some of that content was more opinionated as well. Like I've got a SNES Shmups video, which I really don't like. I go back and I look at it, I'm like, this video's terrible. But it's got like 40 to 50,000 views on it. And like that to me is like, okay, I spent 30 to 40 hours making this video. And actually maybe more in the case of that. I had to record a lot of footage for that video. It kind of paid off, and it got a reaction out of people. Not always a great reaction, because my opinions were kind of a little blunt and harsh in certain ways, and there are certain games I don't like as much that other people really like Space Megaforce and Axelay. And so a lot of people were railing on me and calling me an idiot for my takes on those, but it's like, I don't know, man. But I would have focused more on, like, again, retrospective type of content. And the reason for that is, for one, retrospective types of content. Like, if you go back and you watch my Viewpoint, a side-by-side comparison, you watch my CDI mouse video, those were all, like, 2011 or 2012. Like, those were light years beyond, like, any of my basic playthrough content in terms of, like, editing and stuff like that. I hadn't really nailed my delivery, you know, when it came to the voice acting, which I feel like I did get better later on. I tried my Castlevania tutorial, probably 3 or 4 years ago now, and my Ghosts and Demons like beginner's guide 3 or 4 years ago. I'm really proud of both those videos, but I haven't really pursued those types of videos again, because they're a ton of work and they didn't get the views I wanted. And it's just I've solidified this channel as like a gameplay channel basically, and like it's, if I solidified it more as a retrospective kind of channel back in the day, then I think my channel would have taken off a lot more than it has. So, you know, as of November 2023, I'm sitting at around close to 14,000 subscribers. I'm only getting about 50 subscribers a month on average. It's not much. So the growth is super slow. However, if I was doing more retrospective type of content and was already known for that, I think my my growth would have been a lot faster. My numbers would probably be a lot higher right now, and that feeds into motivation to keep doing this, because life is short. We're not going to live forever, and I only have so much time in the day and only so much energy to you know, pursue this this hobby. And I'm like, I think if I went in a different direction with content back in the day, I would have been more satisfied. Not just from like the views standpoint and the growth, because that is a motivator, but I'd also be more satisfied in the actual creation process, the creative process. Like, I really enjoyed like coming up with ways of doing screen transitions and stuff like that, and overlays and whatnot, and making my stuff look really clean and presentable. Especially back in 2011 or 2012 in the retro scene, people weren't doing a lot of that, and I felt like you know, my stuff definitely had potential. There was a lot of stuff I had to work on, but it also had potential, but I just kind of squandered it. You know, lack of motivation. I would grab the lowest hanging fruit. You know, oh, let me do yet another Castlevania playthrough with no editing on top. It's like, yeah, I had my own template that I you know, put together, and yeah, my videos faded in and out and whatever, but it's just really basic content anybody could hack together. And I don't even think my personality has really been all that interesting in a lot of my videos over the years. You know, I go back and I look at old gameplay videos, and I'm just, I don't know, I'm not an entertainer, you know? I talk about what's on the screen, and some people appreciate it, but I think most people just probably, you know, find it dull, and, you know, it's like they're watching a brick wall. So, I don't know. Yeah. Going all the way back, I definitely would have done that differently. I would have doubled down on retrospective type of content. Not necessarily just retrospective type of content, but just stuff that would allow me to like actually edit stuff and get creative with that process. You know, reviews of like hardware, you know, retrospectives on my favorite games and stuff like that. I mean, especially back then, it was still kind of a new thing, and so, you know, I was there at the ground level, like when all this stuff was just forming, you know. But now there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of creators out there all doing the same thing, and so even if I tried switching into that direction now, I'd be buried in a sea of hundreds to thousands of other channels that are again doing the same thing, and you just get buried. But back when I was doing it, like there wasn't that many people doing it, and so my channel most likely would have been discovered by a lot more people, and I'd be in a totally different position right now when it comes to you know, the overall health of my channel. So would I have done anything else different? I'm trying to think. I think one thing I would have done differently is I probably wouldn't have focused on streaming on Twitch so often. I did that a lot. Like in early 2015, I discovered live streaming, and for about a year, like I almost completely ignored my YouTube channel for about a year. Or when I did post something, it was just like, you know, straight gameplay videos that no one wanted to see. Another thing I would have done is I would have broken off other types of content earlier. So when I first started my YouTube channel, where this is 2009, and it was a super casual thing. I mean, it took me, I think it was a couple years to get to my first 1,000 subscribers, and you know, that was a big milestone for me. But that was a long time of me just, you know, not really doing. I don't know. I was doing a lot of different things with my channel, nothing particularly interesting. Like one day I would post some game music, and then the next day I would post a DJ set. I used to do like, you know, electronic music DJing as a hobby, and then the next day I'd talk about pinball, and then the next day I'd show off what pickups I picked up from like the thrift store or used game store or something like that. And then the next day I would do just a gameplay and talk, where I'd have the camcorder on the TV and I'd play a game for 10 minutes and talk over it and give my opinions. And then, like, I don't know, there was just, there were tag videos back in the day, you know? I would respond to tag videos. I think Old School Retro Gamer was one of them. I think I responded to one of his videos back in the day, and I wish I still had that video, because I actually thought that was a cool one. I was talking about like the N-Gage and Sega CD. I would do system overviews, but they were crappy. I would just have a shaky cam, like, you know, and I'd be talking over it, and I'd put some bad electronic music on in the background, and Yeah, it's I don't know. My channel was not focused when I started because none of us had any idea what we were doing. We were just passionate about sharing our love for video games back then, and that was a big driving factor. But then, like, you know, once we were in it for a couple of years, just started to get a little more serious about it. I got my first capture card. I came off of dabbling with some, you know, music creation with digital audio workstations, mostly electronic music. I did that for a couple of years as fun. It was something fun to learn from scratch, and that translated into video editing software. And so I got Sony Vegas, and it just clicked right away. And then before you know it, I had scripted videos, and you know, it was that was a different change in direction, and a change of direction I felt like would have been much better for my channel if I actually buckled down on it and stuck with it. But I didn't. You know, I ended up just kind of like landing in the pit that is playthroughs, and you know, I'm good at playthroughs in terms of actually beating the games. Like, you know, I'd like to think I'm a decent player through and through, and especially nowadays, you know, we're talking 2023 versus 2010. Like, you know, I can pick up stuff now and just roll right through them or pick them up very, very quickly. Whereas even back in 2010, like, I still struggled to like relearn Ninja Gaiden and stuff like that. But nowadays, like, I can sleepwalk my way through it. So I'm definitely at a different level now, gameplay wise, but I definitely had some good accomplishments in the early days. So there was some cool stuff with the gameplay videos. Like, I think I got a 1 credit clear, or I don't know if it was 1 credit clear. Maybe I continued once, but Diamaka Miura on the Super Graphics, which is, you know, the Super Graphics version of Ghouls and Ghosts, the arcade game. Very, very difficult game, especially the Super Graphics version. And I managed to do that, like, you know, live on the spot. Decided to introduce a webcam and introduce the whole Let's Play format as opposed to just long plays with post commentary, and I don't know. Anyway, I'm just starting to ramble, but yeah, while I had some good achievements with the gameplay stuff, just personal achievements, like, I don't know, people don't really care about that type of content a lot unless you're like super interesting, you're entertaining, you know, you make jokes all the time and stuff like that, and that's just never been me. I've never been the kind of person to really like riff on games as I play them. I don't riff on movies even. Like, I want to watch something that's really good, or even if I'm, you know, in terms of video games, if I'm playing something that a lot of people would consider to be bad, I want to try to find the good in it, or I want to find the fun, as I like to say. But I've never been one of those channels that's super entertaining. However, my scripted stuff, I always felt pretty decent about that stuff, because you can be serious with scripted content and it can still be interesting, because it's not about your personality so much as it is the information you're giving in that. And so I think I would have definitely excelled as a channel much more if I went more in that direction. So but yeah, I mean, I'm surprised some of you guys still stick with me. I appreciate it. But that is definitely a few things I would have done differently in the early days of YouTube, knowing what I know now. Oh, wait, no, there's one more. I would have gotten a capture card right away. I would have completely skipped out on the whole camcorder thing. I was shot gameplay with my camcorder at a TV for like a couple years. Yeah, again, none of us knew what we were doing when we first got into making YouTube videos. Alright, the next topic comes from Scott Linux. He asks, what is your overall preferred controller, be that for a console or PC? So Scott, I don't really have a singular, like, preferred controller. Like, I don't have one controller I can just use for everything in my collection. I mean, if I got close to something like that and we just relegated all this to retro games, let's say, I don't know, PlayStation 2 and prior, or let's go with like a PlayStation 1 and prior, it would probably be the Super Nintendo controller. Like on my Mr. FPGA, I actually have a 8-bit DOE SN30 Pro, which is basically a Super Nintendo layout, very similar D-pad. Buttons aren't as snappy as regular SNES buttons are, but, you know, it gets the job done. It's got the same form factor. It's got 2 sets of shoulder keys, so I can use it with PS1 games. I'll use that with something like the Mister, and I'll just, you know, I'll play NES with it, I'll play Genesis with it, I'll play PlayStation with it, I'll do Super Nintendo, Game Boy Advance, 32X, whatever. And it works well enough across all those platforms. But generally, if I have the choice, I prefer to use the original OEM pads for just about almost any console. Not all consoles, like Sega Master System, for instance. I much prefer the Genesis 3 button with that, especially if I'm using it on like the Mega SG, because then I can map the start button to the pause functionality, which you can't do if you're using it on original hardware, or at least not without some really clever trickery. And you know, like the original Master System controller, I like the buttons, but the D-pad is one of the worst I've ever used. It's so easy to do diagonals and not go in the proper direction that you're trying to go in, and that's extremely frustrating. Whereas I never had that problem with an NES controller. But yeah, I digress. You know, most consoles, I prefer the first-party options. It just feels the most natural. It's what the consoles came with. It's what we used for years and years, you know, back in the day. And, you know, there are a couple of examples, though, where there were re-released controllers or updated revisions that I do feel improved on the original. A great example is the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive. The launch of the 6-button controller was great. Obviously, you had those extra buttons for fighting games, but I felt the floating D-pad was a lot nicer than the more recessed D-pad of the original 3-button Genesis controller. Likewise, with our Sega Saturn in North America, the second controller that came out, which was actually the default controller in Japan, but we call it now the Model 2 controller, because in America we had this big, unwieldy, kind of weird controller for the Model 1 system. And it's still actually a decent controller. If you get around its weirdness, it actually is quite comfortable. I actually really like the Model 1 Saturn controller, but the Model 2 Saturn controllers, that's just, for 2D gaming, that's probably one of the best controllers ever made. You know, if you're just going to play 2D games, the Saturn Model 2 controller is fantastic. It's got a similar floating D-pad to the Genesis 6-button, but it's even better. It's more responsive and precise, and the buttons, you know, they feel really good. Like they pop back up really quickly, so it's very good for arcade style games. And the shoulder keys have these really nice micro switches under them that have this like very soft, clicky sound and feel, and it's just very satisfying to use. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, I prefer OG controllers, the OEMs. You know, again, with emulation boxes and stuff like that. There are preferred controllers for me, either the SNES style controllers or even just a PS1 classic controller, which is USB, and I'll use that for emulation boxes and FPGA multi-systems and stuff like that. And it works well across multiple platforms, feels good enough, you know, for a lot of those things. But if I'm playing on real hardware, then I definitely want the OEM controllers. They just, you know, they feel the best. Most third-party options back in the day were always lacking in some major way. Like, okay, maybe you had, like, I remember having an Interact pad on Super Nintendo that felt okay for the most part, but it was like, I don't think there was a pivot on the D-pad, or the pivot was really tiny, and so like you'd hit multiple, you know, direction angles, and like you'd end up going diagonally when you're just trying to go straight and stuff like that. Or going back to the Master System controller, this is OEM, it's not third party, but it's still the same kind of problem. I'd be playing Outrun and just trying to turn left and right, and my car would start slowing down for no apparent reason. It was because it was accidentally triggering up or down, which switches gears in that version of the game, and so, you know, makes it very difficult to play it, and makes it very difficult to enjoy it. And that's my experience with a lot of third-party controllers. There are a couple of exceptions, like I know ASCII, back in the day, they made some decent pads with like good D-pads, but even there, like their buttons a lot of times didn't feel as good as, say, you know, Sega's or Nintendo's, or like the controllers were shaped weird or something like that, you know. So like a lot of third-party options, some of them could be decent, but they were always still lacking in one way or another, which, you know, really brought the whole experience down. So I've always been of the mindset, well, I'm just going to use the OEM controllers. And I've dabbled with a lot of third-party accessories. It's not like I'm a stranger to third-party controllers and accessories. I even have a lot right now of my own. But yeah, just that's just one of those truths in gaming for me. At least to me, it seems like one that the OEM, at least when it comes to the big companies like Nintendo, Sega, Sony, Microsoft, you know, guys like that, they had the money and R&D development, you know, to create like these controllers that felt great. Lots of refinement, and you know, they just feel fantastic. And so, you know, even to this day, I will still just use first-party controllers, and I've dabbled with a bunch of third-party ones. Power A in particular on Switch, their D-pads are terrible. You know, very little pivot, very easy to do accidental diagonals. It's crazy to me that companies these days are still getting that stuff wrong, and so I just do first party. That is it. Now, Scott, I will say, when it comes to PC, I'll typically just do keyboard and mouse on PC, because when I play PC games, I'm generally playing first-person shooters for the most part. It's my most played PC genre. And, you know, when it comes to that, it really doesn't matter the setup as long as I've got, you know, WSAD and space key and stuff like that, and, you know, a mouse on the other hand. I'm generally pretty good. I don't map a lot of stuff like mouse buttons. I just need a left button and right button and a scroll wheel to like scroll through weapons. But no real preference there, though I do, like a lot of people nowadays, I like mechanical keyboards. You know, there's a tactile set of feedback you get through that you don't really get with membrane keys. It's just more satisfying for me to use. So for PCs, I will prefer a mechanical keyboard. Even my retro PC keyboard is a mechanical. It's a cheaper one, but still mechanical, and still has a nice tactile feeling to it that I don't get with membrane pads. So Scott actually asked a follow-up question. He says, do you prefer original controllers with retro console stuff or no? So I've already kind of, like, I guess, answered that. But yes, for retro console stuff, absolutely, I prefer the originals, the OEM ones for sure. Again, they just feel so much better to me. They're also a lot more reliable. I've had a lot of third-party controllers just die on me over the years, where, like, I don't think I've ever had a first-party controller just outright die without me throwing it against a wall or something. Like, you know, like, you just have it sitting on your desk and it just, out of nowhere, stops working. Like, I don't even think I've had a first-party controller do that to me. But third-party controllers I have. They just, out of nowhere, they just stop working. They just, no, we're done. You know, I've always been of the mindset, well, maybe not always, not when I was a kid and I had no money, so I did buy a lot of third-party controllers back then. But now I'm of the mindset that you get what you pay for. And, you know, if you go back and you open up some of those third-party controllers and you look at the build quality on the inside of those versus the OEMs, it's like night and day in some cases. It's insane. So if you have access to a lot of third-party stuff, I do recommend doing that. It's kind of eye-opening, actually. So, I mean, that's also why they were able to sell a lot of these third-party controllers for like $10, brand new, whereas the OEM might have been 20 or 30. You know, so, but again, you get what you pay for, so. Alright guys, so this is our last topic of discussion, and this one might not appeal to everybody here because it's not necessarily related to retro gaming, but it is related to one of my hobbies I'm the most passionate about, which is pinball. So this actually comes from Seb, aka the Half-Blind Gamer, who also has his own YouTube channel. He's been doing this just as long as I have. So you guys should go check him out, and he's a great streamer, and he covers a lot of obscure stuff too, including the Philips CDI. So you should definitely check out his channel. I'll put a link in the description box below, and I'll tag him on that. But he says, when it comes to pinball, what can make or break them for you? What features are you looking forward to the most, or which features do you hate to see on them? So this is actually it's kind of an interesting one, and it's going to be really difficult for people not familiar with pinball to imagine. But I've been playing pinball since 2010. It was actually a year after I started my YouTube channel. I discovered a machine called Avatars, based on the movie by James Cameron. Came out that same year, and it's ironically the one game I own right now. I actually got it a couple months ago as of doing this video. Second time I've owned an Avatar, actually. And let's see. My pinball journey's been a long journey. It's been 13 years now. You know, it's been almost as long as my YouTube journey. And so I've gone through different phases with pinball. I've gone through phases where I've been really bitter about the whole hobby because I've gotten into competition. You know, I'm a fairly skillful player that can compete decently in the tournament scene. But my opinions on what makes a game tick for me have changed as well. You know, I started off with games that were really simple. When I found my first place to play, a lot of the games at that location were from like the 80s and 90s. So their rule sets weren't as complicated as, you know, especially not as complicated as games today. And, you know, there was a point when I started buying machines of my own, starting in 2013, and I started streaming pinball in 2015. I started, like, getting this hankering for, like, really deep games with lots of features, lots of nuanced rules, and I was basically out on this quest to try to find, like, the deepest game that would... With the idea being like the deepest game would keep me the most occupied. Like if I had a Simpsons pinball party, which is still one of the most loaded, packed tables I think ever created, I would be happy forever. I would never get bored. But what ended up happening is I had a bunch of really deep games, and the opposite happened. I ended up getting tired of them because they would take me like an hour to play one game. Whereas something like Avatar, I can play 5, 6, 7 games in that 1 hour, and it's more exhilarating because it's faster, it's harder, requires you to be better at the game, not just knowing how to progress through the game rules-wise, but also controlling the ball and just having to be able to react to like just crazy wild spins and, you know, save the ball from going down the out lanes. And it's really hard to explain if you're not into pinball and you don't play a lot of pinball. A lot of this probably just isn't even going to make any sense, but this all kind of loops back around to like what can make or break a game for me. So kind of continuing on that line of thought, you know, for a long time it was like the early days of YouTube for me, where I was like really opinionated about video games. And for the longest time, I was really opinionated about pinball. Like, oh, I don't like this feature about this. Oh, this thing holds the ball too long when you hit this shot. I want the ball back now so I can flip it again. Or like, oh, this one has animations I can't skip by pressing the flipper buttons. It slows the game down. Or, you know, this game is too stop and go. You know, I want to just be able to shoot ramps over and over, just combo ramps really fast. Or... I don't like how this mode plays out. I don't like shooting these shots. They should have done it this way. And it's just like opinionated garbage. Maybe some of it is valid. Maybe others are not. You know, it's subjective in some cases, or a lot of cases when it comes to opinions. But now I don't really care that much. Like, I try not to overthink pinball these days in terms of like, oh, I'd rather like this shot to be on a different shot on the playfield, or I'd rather this piece of music used here or there, or, you know, it's just, I just focus on playing the game because that's where I get my enjoyment. It's not so much about like features that are implemented or not implemented, or what could have been or what should have been. It's just, I just take the game for what it is, and I learn it, and I learn how to exploit it, And then I just play it and I enjoy it for what it is. And you know, if there's a feature on it I don't quote unquote like it doesn't matter. I can go play hundreds of other games. I don't, you know, have to be stuck on this singular game. So, I will say, what are features I do really like on pinball machines? I mean, this is very common to pinball machines, but I do like simplicity. You know, my favorite games are Iron Man, Tron Legacy, Avatar, Rolling Stones, games like that they have a lot of like similar features. They got full orbit shots, ball goes around all the way around back to the flippers. They typically have ramp shots. Avatar only has one, so you can't combo ramps, but Iron Man has two, so you can go back and forth. But then you can hit an orbit after you do that, and the ball just goes flying around, and there's different skills you can do to mitigate that. But I found over the years I definitely prefer short, hard, difficult rule sets, brutal games that are just challenging, because it forces me to be the best player that I can be. If I want to succeed on those games and have long games, like, I've got to be on my A game all the time, and that's satisfying to me. But there's also things I really enjoy, like I enjoy certain soundtracks. Like I love the soundtrack in the Iron Man pinball machine. It's got this awesome hard rock. A lot of it comes from the movie, the first Iron Man movie. And the sound effects, the sound effect package also makes a big difference too. Avatar, Tron, Iron Man, they all have great sound effects packages. The guy back then, David Thiel, that was doing the audio for those games, he was very skillful, I think, audio designer, and the way he implements like certain sound effects or builds on those sound effects. Like, say you have a repeated sound effect every time you hit a ramp, but it'll like build and build and build, and it'll just crescendo eventually, and that exhilarates you as a player. Like, you hit this shot and the sound volume will keep rising, or the tone of it will keep rising, and you know, there's this feedback loop you get as you hit stuff on a pinball machine. Audio is a big part of that. So that's one thing that can make or break a game for me. Well, not necessarily break, but it can make me appreciate other games a lot more than others, which is why I love, you know, some of those 2010 era Stern machines so much, is because of like the audio packages. You know, the way the sound effects will crescendo as you hit stuff back to back. It's very satisfying, and just gets the blood pumping. You know, games with like really boring soundtracks don't really do it for me. You know, like, I like the games with energetic music. Yeah, I'm trying to think of what are features that I definitely don't like on pinball machines, and I'm you know, I don't. there's some really old pinball machines like Black Hole, where there's a lower playfield you can access, and if you don't qualify certain things, when the ball kicks back up to the normal playfield, it'll just drain it. So if you fail on the lower playfield, you drain on the upper playfield, and that's insanely frustrating to me. That is definitely a feature I don't like. There is a way to mitigate it on that game, but it's still kind of a crapshoot. And so, yeah, that is a feature I definitely do not like. Also, I don't know. I'm thinking certain gimmicks on certain games are a little frivolous and just kind of pointless. So Stern Pinball in, I don't know, 2010-ish started. Actually, I think Avatar was the first one of the first ones, where when they released the game, they had not just a base model, but they had a beefed up limited edition model. And on the limited edition model, they would add some extra features, but because I think funds were kind of tight at the time, you know, they were just kind of like basic gimmicks. So great examples on Rolling Stones limited edition. Same playfield layout, all that stuff. However, there were magnets under the playfield on the LE. So when you played multi-ball, the magnets would be constantly grabbing the balls and flinging them all over the place. There were 3 magnets. There's a lot of magnets underneath the playfield. And Rolling Stones is one of the harder games out there. And so what you're doing is, yeah, it's fun seeing the balls fling around, but if you're actually trying to play the game and trying to succeed at it, it's a lot harder than the Pro or the base model. Stern calls the base models the Pro models. It gets a little confusing if you're not familiar with pinball. And so, like, okay, you've got this beefed up limited edition machine, but it's not as fun to play because there's just this gimmick that doesn't really need to exist, you know. It's fine for people that are terrible at pinball and they just want to see the ball bounce around and they want to see the lights and the sound show or hear the sound show, you know, which is fine. You know, things like pinball, just like video games, can appeal to different audiences. But for someone like myself, who's a skilled player, like, you don't want that randomness in there, because again, the multi-balls are really hard to complete on that game. There are objectives that you need to complete, and the magnets just make it insanely difficult to actually reach that completion state. And then you just feel deflated when you're done with your game. You're like, well, this is just kind of a bummer. So when I had a Rolling Stones LE, I actually disabled the magnets. It's in software. You can go in and disable them. So I basically made it more like the base Pro model. So basically it plays more consistently. So, which I think is very important in pinball. That's actually another thing I really like, is the consistency of shots in pinball. There are some games where you'll shoot a shot successfully, but it'll just throw the ball out of control. So you in turn get punished for making a shot, and you should never get punished for making a shot in pinball. So anyway, I can go on all day about this topic, but for anybody curious, I have a separate pinball channel. It's called AKM's Pinball Videos. Just A like Alpha, K like Kilo, M like Mike. Those are my initials. You type your initials in on pinball machines when you get high scores. So if you're ever in the Northern Virginia or DC area, you'll probably see my initials on the machines. So if you ever do see that, feel free to pop a comment on one of my videos and say hi. Let me know that you were in the area. But yeah, I've had that pinball channel for a long time. I do pinball gameplay videos. I'll do live tutorials and stuff like that, and live streams, just like I do here on my gaming YouTube channel. But yeah, feel free to check that out if you are interested or are a fan of pinball. So for anybody that's stuck around to the end here, thank you guys for listening. I will do my best to try to fish for more topics of discussion for these backer Q&A videos. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. If you have any questions or comments, as usual, post them down in the comments below. Or if you have any responses to the topics in question, say you want to answer these topics yourself, feel free to do that in the comments as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts and perspectives and experiences and stuff like that. But yeah, that's going to do it for me. That was the last topic. Thanks again, Seb, aka Half-Blind Gamer. Thanks everybody else, Venom Lace, Die Hard Jagged, Scott Lennox, for participating in this. And like I said, I'll do my best to try to get another one of these out sometime soon, since this whole podcasty type of format seems to be somewhat appealing to some of you guys out there. So again, hopefully you guys enjoyed this. And I'll be back with something else sometime soon. So until the next one, guys, take it easy.